Thanks ever so much. It's really superb exposition of Victorinus, I think.
Maybe
what do you do? Is that on? Oh, okay. Like a pop singer. Okay.
yeah. Thank you.
Okay, babes. Okay. So a really wonderful exposition of Victorinus. I just wanted to ask if you would agree that there's a further distinction between Augustine and Victorinus, insofar as Augustine explicitly rejects the idea that God is causa sui. But Plotinus, of course, says that the one is causa sui, and Victorinus also has the idea, so that his whole conception of the Trinity, as it were, making itself, is an idea of God, I think, as causa sui. So, because later down the line, most of the Christian tradition rejects the idea of God as causa sui. But it raises the really interesting question of whether, in fact, if you go in the more Plotinian direction of thinking God is self-creating, this actually makes more sense of the Trinity, including, and that would connect to the idea that Victorinus is able to give a much more natural place to the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit is finality. It's the intellect is only completed, in the Holy Spirit. So that, I think Victorinus represents for us an incredible challenge. And Arugana, of course, is very similar. He also says the Trinity is causa sui, and then Eckhart and Nicholas Acutis say the same thing. So this is, you might say this is an underground alternative tradition. But what I wanted to ask you is that, in a way, Victorinus and Augustine seem like equally valid ways to go. First of all, because at the beginning of St. John's Gospel, the Son is logos, but also life, the life of men. So, do you stress the Son as logos on wisdom, or do you stress the Son as life? These seem equally valid possibilities. And also, in effect, they're reading Neoplatonism differently. That, Augustine is sort of echoing the triad of the one and the intellect and then the soul, in effect. But Victorinus, with greater insights, confirmed by recent scholarship, is aware that actually between the one and the intellect, Plotinus sneaks in the Stoic principle of life. This is Pierre Hadot has drawn this to our attention, and of course he wrote very important book about Porphyry and Victorinus, as you know. So it's also kind of like, it's a different reading of St. John's Gospel, and it's a different take on the Neoplatonic legacy. So my question to you, and this is something I'd really kind of like to be able to do, is can we somehow synthesize Victorinus and Augustine? Is there a way of doing justice to the powerful insights of both these?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the question of the autogenesis is very interesting. This what you call causa sui, and what Victorinus says, in fact, is that the Son, especially the Son, is the causa sui, and that he has the life in himself, as we read in the Gospel of John, and. Probably, you can find more information about this in the note 11 to my paper. There is a fragment of Porphyry where there is also, we can read about the autogenesis. So I think it could have been the inspiration of yeah, but you know that the sources of Victorinus are obscure, even more obscure than his writings themselves. So I would not like to argue that it is really Porphyry who was his source, because I cannot tell, as Pierre Hadot affirmed, in fact. But I'm not sure about this, what is the source, but it is surely a Neoplatonic, I would say Neoplatonic source for Adversarium 3 and 4, even more developed stage of Neoplatonism than in Porphyry, I would say. But still, we have these previous concepts of Neoplatonism quoted in Proclus. So it may be that finally Proclus would be the source. But I don't know, actually I don't know. But the autogenesis, in fact, is very interesting, and you are right, that Augustine really openly rejects this idea, and it is not the only idea of Victorinus which he rejects. He rejects the androgynous nature of Christ, and he also rejects the idea of that you will have the Trinity as a father, mother, and a baby, or something like this. So we can find a lot of clues in Augustine's work that he really read Victorinus. What I emphasize in the conclusion of my paper was a short comparison of both, and I think there is a heritage which is in common to both. And it is really the perichoresis, which is derived from the Neoplatonic predominance. Then the relations of origin, which is so much important to Victorinus. I emphasize this again and again, that there is not a reversible relationship between this causality of pre-existence and existence, pre-existent unum and unum, etc. So he really emphasized the one-way derivation, so to say, which will also be the case in Augustine. And then what is perhaps important, that the events of the history of salvation are in fact a kind of clue or a kind of analogy to the intra-Trinitarian processions themselves. And that you will find in Augustine as well. So I think there are many points which are in common, and you also find the differences as the autogenesis and the androgynous nature of Christ, etc. But to simplify it would be to kill it, in fact. You cannot simplify, really. He develops, in fact, I limited myself to Ad versus Arium 1a and 1b, but 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, in fact, is more and more complex, to be honest.
Yeah, thanks for the question as well as for the answer. And so next two answers. Next two questions, sorry.
Thank you, both of you, for your presentations. I have two questions for both of you. For Florensky presentation, I have a question about the influence of the avant-garde movement on his theology of art. You spoke about his view of the Trinity and the relationship between Trinity and art, and we know that he was very influenced by the avant-garde movement in Russia at that time, and especially by some of the new findings of the linear perspective that he wrote about, which we find in painters like Malevich, for instance, and others, and also the symbolist movement, people like Andrei Bely and so on. So are there any traces of influence in his theology of art of the avant-garde movement at that time in Russia? That would be my question to you. And for Lenka, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have a question about Erugena, of course. Are there some traces of influence of Victorinus in Erugena? Because there are, in terms of the theology, there are many key insights that they share, I think. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. What you see was an attempt to say about Florensky theory of icon without even mentioning reversed perspective and all these things which are very well discussed and very well known. And I think that this is a rather a question of technique of representation, and I was interested in the very ontology of representation. So, of course, there are absolutely, it's a huge continent of his theory of art, including reverse perspective, including symbolism, including influences. But I would say that he visited a collection of Picasso works in Moscow at the beginning of the 20th century, and he was deeply influenced by it, and he was there's this very ambiguous ambiguous attitude to Picasso. From the one side, he thought that this is the decadent art of Western civilization and so on. But he noticed that this is a kind of that this art is ontologically interesting, since it is a kind of analysis that Picasso in the early period, he tried to analyze objects trying to integrate many perspectives, and he found it very inspirational and very, very interesting. So there is an ambiguity towards this art, and I think, and it is in the meaning of idealism. Recently translated into English work of early work of Florensky, which I think is very illuminated, and it completes the view from iconostasis, which is much more critical to contemporary art.
Thank you very much for this very interesting question concerning Victorinus and Eriugena. Well, there is an article, as far as I know, just one article written in Spanish. Unfortunately, I've forgotten the name of the author, but you will find easily that there is a kind of influence of Victorinus on Eriugena. And it is not just mediated through Augustine, which would be the basic idea you can have. Because there are some special similarities, as if I'm not mistaken, there is this division of being and non-being, what is esse and non-esse, and a very similar statement you can find in Victorinus as well. The more attractive, I would say, would be perhaps the theophanic idea of Eriugena, whether or not there is a kind of, but I think here Eriugena is unique, really, to think the transcendent and immanence of God in this way, that God creates himself as the world, and then, in fact, as the weight of the world of ideas, if you wish so, in the Logos, and then that he develops into the theophany of the world, which is, in fact, the motion entrusted to the Holy Spirit. So you can find these two motions, which is probably, maybe it can recall Victorinus as well, but I would say that this idea, God creating himself, you cannot accept this autogenesis. You cannot really find in Victorinus, if I'm not mistaken. But what I can recommend, it was a cherished idea of my late teacher, Werner Bayer-Walters. And in his writings, perhaps you can find some clues not only to the German idealistic thinking, of which the Eriugena could be understood as a predecessor, but also as the heritor of this thinking of not only of Augustine and Gregor of Nyssa and Dionysius, of course, but also of Marius Victorinus, if in a more hidden way, probably.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, unluckily, we have no enough space for other questions because of the time schedule, but the discussion can continue, of course, during the break, which is now and which will end at 10:15. We will continue here. Thank you once more. Thank you once more.